I'd really like to thank you for the sterling work you're doing. It's absolutely monumental, and congratulations. I'm going to talk about professionalism and quality in the elderly, and I just realised I do have a conflict to declare because I'm over 65, so I may well be talking about myself, so thank you for reminding me of that, John. I wanted to talk about these issues in particular. I want to get the concept of what professionalism is and what it means in the context of the elderly, because it does have a particular context. I've also something a little bit to one side. I'm going to talk about how professionalism impacts decision making, because it does. So to start with, what is a profession? Now, some people believe a profession is essentially doing something for money, doing something well, but I want to unpack it because I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I'm going to pose this question to you. Are all these people professionals? This is a quote from Geoffrey Davies, a well-known Queensland jurist. And he defined professionalism as a profession, as a group that has a body of knowledge and skills so specialised and important to a community that is allowed to self-regulate. So it's a profession or a professional. It's a true privilege, and let's see if the College of Surgeons fulfils that. So we do have a defined standard of education, training, and practice. So that's got to be part of. So that's the issue of a precious skill. We have a true ethical obligation when using those skills. We do belong to a professional association. That's the clubhouse behind us, I guess, but it is an association. We are part of a body. We do serve a true importance to the community, and it's a valued importance. So far we're running pretty well. We self-regulate, well, do we? And I think you'll see by what's being discussed about college issues that self-regulation is becoming more and more important to underscore it. And in fact, we are being approached by APRA to do even more in that regard, which I'd be happy to talk about later. And there is a societal expectation and a social contract. So I think we are true professionals, and this is reflected in our pledge. The pledge is not that old. It's about 7 years old, and it was written by David Waters and Michael Griggs, and it was a response to an interesting experience at the American College, because they do have a pledge. I'm going to read it to you because I think it encompasses what our profession is about, or what we are about as part of that profession. I pledge to always act in the best interests of my patients, respecting their autonomy and rights. I undertake to improve my knowledge and skills, evaluate and reflect on my performance, which we're talking about today. I agree to continue learning and teaching for the benefit of my patients, my trainees and my community. I will be respectful of my colleagues and readily offer them my assistance and support. I will abide by the code of conduct of this college and will never allow consideration of financial reward, career advancement, or reputation to compromise my judgment or the care I provide. That's an incredibly important component. And I accept the responsibility and challenge of being a surgeon and a fellow of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. That encompasses what we believe to be our professional obligation. And from this flows a code of conduct. So when you look at this group of people, are they all professionals? The answer is probably no. Some are, but some aren't. If you engage a house painter and say, I want the house painted, is that house painter going to say, it doesn't need it yet, wait 4 or 5 more years? But we're meant to do those sorts of things. We are meant to make comment and advice that's reflective purely on the patient and not our personal gain. It's a principle of indifference. And when I first heard that term, I thought, gee, that's a shabby term. But what it really means is that whatever advice you give, you must not benefit from it personally, financially, or in any way. It has to be the right advice for a particular patient. That's what indifference means, and it underpins professionalism. And as you said at the very beginning of our pledge, I pledge to always act in the best interests of my patient, respecting their autonomy and rights. In our code of conduct, these are the things that underscore this. We must be sensitive and aware of their needs, which means we have to talk to them at great length. We do not exploit patients. We fully disclose and we're transparent in what we do. We allow time for the patient to consider options and will offer a second opinion if required. That is our professional obligation. I want to share this with you. I came across this some years ago. I don't know how actually I did. It's written by a guy by the name of Michael O'Donnell. Now, that probably means nothing to you, but Michael O'Donnell he's the son of a doctor, a GP in York. He went to Cambridge and got pretty much tied up in the light theatre, as many people do, I suppose, of great interest in the performing arts. And he did practice for 12 years. I don't know if people recall a show called My Word. When I was a kid, it used to be on the ABC. And he was the host of this show, I found out subsequently. And it was a bit like a Stephen Fry character, where they'd have these pompous people and they'd put words and phrases up and they'd make these ridiculous comments on what they meant. It was hilarious. And that was Michael O'Donnell. And he wrote this as part of an address he gave to the Royal Society. Doctors have to treat illness rather than disease and need to understand the feelings of regret, guilt, fear, betrayal, loneliness and other perplexing emotions that turn the same disease into different illnesses and different people. Now, this was an observation he made as his father went as a child, because he used to go on rounds with his father to house. And this was the observation he made of his father, where he would behave quite differently with different people with the same illness. They all had the flu, but the impact of that was different to them. And what this means is it allows you to act. In fact, as a clinician, you must act, because your sincerity is real, but you should not behave in the same way with every patient, because they're the same disease as a different illness to them. So you have to be responsive to that. It also, I think, is a wonderful description of what empathy is. He was witnessing empathy, because empathy is acting, and I'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment. So and I recommend this article to you because I think it's an extraordinarily interesting one. I bought this book some time ago called Being Mortal. I'm a real fan of Atul Gawande. I read all these other books and I was a little bit frightened about this one, because I thought it was going to be all about physician-assisted suicide and other things. I thought, well, it's probably the modern feel, and it's something that I personally have a huge issue with. But it wasn't. And if you haven't read this book, I'd like you to, because it's all about goal setting in the elderly, about communication, and then he walks you through palliative care of his own father, which is really quite moving. And he placed himself as a consumer in a way of what happens at that stage of life. His father developed a very strange intramedullary cervical tumour that led to his eventual paralysis. And he talked about how the important thing for him to know is what his father wanted. What was his goal? What was his minimum requirement? And he talked a little bit about communication styles. He did attribute this to someone else, but I thought this is interesting. He talks about a paternalistic doctor, an informative doctor, or interpretive. And I think you'll understand what these are. And he uses the example of this. The paternalistic doctor, take the red pill, not the blue, because I know best. And that was very much a style that I reflected on when I was a student, where people would talk in that way, and people still do. Oh, I did something there that I shouldn't have. There we go. The next is the informative doctor, and I think there's a pattern emerging now that this is the right thing to do, and I challenge it. This is what the red pill does, and here's what the blue pill does. You've got to make your own mind up. This is informed consent in the view of some people. He then talked about the interpretive doctrine. I think this is the ideal. What are your concerns? What are your worries? How do you want this treatment to help you? And then, in that case, a red pill will be best for you. So, in other words, you're giving advice based on the information you gain, the material benefit to the patient. And I thought that was a very, very interesting observation. This is an observation of Stuart Dunn. Stuart Dunn is a psychologist. He's worked in palliative care all his professional life, and he's currently, I think he's the Sub-Dean of Admissions at Sydney University. And he talks about professional detachment. And if you look to the right there, that's the professional with their level of excitement or arousal, and the patient clearly very aroused, and the professional keeps fairly low down on the thermometer scale, and it's I can help you best by remaining objective. Now, sometimes there's a place for that, and some people want that. You remain objective, you don't become emotionally involved in any way, and it may be quite useful when you have uncertainty, that you don't know what the right thing is to do and patients are pressuring you, but you can be considered to be aloof and not compassionate. But it is a technique that's used. The other is sympathy. And you can see there that both the patient and the professional are equally aroused. And sometimes you fall into that. I remember not so long ago counselling a guy about his esophagectomy, he had esophageal cancer, and suddenly discovered his birthday was the same day as mine. And all of a sudden I found myself in his position. And I tell you what, it does affect your objectivity. But patients might like it because it builds a relationship, but it's very, very risky. You need to recognise it because it certainly would lead to burnout. You just can't keep it up. But it does happen from time to time. I keep hitting the wrong button. Now, this is empathy, and I think empathy is one of the most difficult things to understand. In this case, the professional has some arousal, but they use the empathy or the arousal of the patient. In other words, engage and reflect it. And some people say it's walking in their shoes. It's not that at all. What I believe it to be is walking beside them. So you're reflective, but you don't get emotionally involved. And this is acting, really, because you're demonstrating an emotion that you're not actually feeling, but you're doing it to reflect their concern. So it takes practice, and it's important that it is practiced. So I can only imagine what you must be feeling. And it builds rapport, but that you've got to be sincere, which means you've got to be rehearsed. There's nothing wrong with it, as O'Donnell said. That is what his father was doing. So what's the impact of professionalism on decision-making? This is work done by Carolyn Moulton. I don't know if you know Carolyn. She's an Australian-trained Canadian surgeon who works in Toronto. She's an upper GI surgeon. And she does a lot of qualitative research, does lots of interviews with people to try and define patterns of behaviour. And this is what she described as the different styles of professional decision-making. And I want you to think about this because it's a litmus that you can all use to measure your own performance. And if someone's close enough to you, then it's something that you may well be able to be criticised for on this basis. And Carolyn told me that when they do M&Ms and things, someone might be accused of being unavowed or disavowed, which is, I'll tell you about that in a moment. Now, what do these things mean? An avowed decision is a patient-centred decision. It's a decision that you can tell anyone about, the patient, their relatives, anyone. You can go into the town square and said you did this because no one will be critical of it. It's totally related to the patient themselves. An unavowed decision is a system-centred decision. It's a decision that you may be forced to make that's reflective of the environment in which you work. It's a little bit shabby. You're not going to tell the patient you made that decision on that basis, but you might bring it up at your department meeting and say, listen guys, it's horrible, we've got to do this, we've got to do something about it. I was forced to do this the other day and it's unacceptable. And a disavowed decision is something that's entirely self-centred and it only benefits you and you probably will never want to tell anyone about it. I'll give you an example to make it a little clearer. We have a scenario of an 80-year-old woman, so she's significantly elderly, and she has a diverticular abscess. I won't go into the detail, but it's decided that she needs an operation to fix it. Don't worry about the context. Now, you've spent a fair bit of time with this lady, and you know that there is a possibility that she may need a colostomy. You know that she is self-caring, lives alone at home with no peripheral services at this time. She's got good vision, no arthritis. If she actually had to look after a colostomy, it wouldn't be making her go to a nursing home. She could cope with it. So that's really important to know that. She doesn't want it, that's her goal, but nonetheless you know that's a possibility that she might need a stoma in certain circumstances. And you say to her, look, it might be possible, I'll do my very best not to do it as she asks. She also happens to be a private patient. So this is the avowed decision. You had to do the colostomy because there was just too much infection, and I was concerned that anastomosis would fall apart and the patient might die. She had some comorbidities. I mean, in young patients, sometimes you can get away with it, but in the elderly, not so easily, as John's data will show you. So you had to come to a decision, and that was the decision you made. Now, your colleague might say to you, I would have given it a go, but that's fine. He might have, or she might have. But you've made this decision in good faith in the interest of the patient, so you're comfortable with it. This is the unavowed decision. I did the colostomy because I had to do another case with cancer. It was someone who's schizophrenic who'd been trying to get into hospital forever, and time was running out, and you know in your hospital if you don't finish by 4:30 you're stopped, and you were concerned that this guy would never come back again, so you didn't do the anastomosis because it would have taken longer. Now, you're not going to talk to the patient about this, and you feel pretty shabby about this, but you think in the sense of the common good and the environment in which you work, this was a valid decision, and you brought it up at your next department meeting, all those sorts of things, but that's an unavowed decision. A disavowed decision is I did the colostomy because she was a private patient and I would get another fee when it's time to close it. I won't make any more comment on that, but that is a disavowed decision. So you can see that this methodology provides you with a personal litmus. You can ask yourself, what sort of decision am I making here, and look at the motive, and I think that's vitally important. And if you're in a department where you know people well, you might challenge some of these decisions on this metric. So I think it's useful. So in summary, it is a privilege to be considered a member of profession, and it's up to us to maintain that status because it can be lost. This carries an obligation to our patients and our community. Our behaviour and decision making must reflect our professionalism. It has to. And it's really important in the elderly in particular that you set goals, that is a mutually set decision, knowing what their expectations are and what you can provide. That's all I have to say. I'd be happy to take any questions if people wished.